Welcome back to HOA Anger. I thought it would be a warning. It was a cover-up. I care what the rule says, Colleen shouted, and she waved a plastic evidence sleeve like it was a search warrant. She stood on my driveway in Bend, Oregon, blocking my car, her purple windbreaker catching the sun. Her tiny body camera clipped to her jacket like she was mall security with delusions of jurisdiction. The enclave at Stonegate HOA had rules, sure, but this was about a service invoice packet she claimed proved I owed $300 for a violation I never committed. She told me I could either pay now or fight a lien later. I teach political science at a community college. I cannot afford complaints or liens showing up on a background check, and Colleen knew that. She smiled when she said lien. I asked to see the actual rule. She waved the sleeve again and told me it was all in there. I asked her to show me the page. She said she did not have to. She was the compliance officer, and compliance officers do not owe explanations to residents who refuse to cooperate. I told her I wanted the board meeting minutes where this fine was voted on. She said the minutes were available on the portal. I told her I checked the portal last night and there was nothing about my property. She said I must have missed it. I pulled out my phone and opened the portal right there. I scrolled through 3 months of minutes. Nothing. I held the screen toward her. She glanced at it and said the upload was delayed due to technical issues. I asked when it would be uploaded. She said soon. I asked what soon meant. She said when the management company got around to it. I asked if she could email me a copy. She said she could not, because the minutes were not finalized yet. I said, "You just told me they were on the portal." She said they were, but the finalized version was not. I asked how I could be fined based on something that was not finalized. She said the board voted, the vote counts, the paperwork is just a formality. Colleen kept the plastic sleeve raised like a prop. I recognized the tactic. She was hoping I would get loud or aggressive so her little body camera could capture a moment she could edit into a harassment complaint. I stayed calm. I asked what the actual violation was. She said unauthorized parking. I said my car was in my own driveway. She said my car was parked in a way that obstructed the sightline for the mail carrier. I looked at my driveway. My car was 3 feet from the curb, the mailbox was 10 feet away, and the mail carrier had never said a word to me in 2 years. I asked if the mail carrier filed a complaint. Colleen said the HOA does not need a complaint to enforce sightline rules. I asked to see the sightline rule. She tapped the plastic sleeve. I asked her to show me the page. She said it was proprietary information. I said HOA rules are not proprietary. They are governing documents. She said this was an operational guideline, not a rule, and operational guidelines are internal. I felt the situation tipping. Colleen was not trying to enforce a rule. She was trying to create a paper trail that would justify a lien and wreck my pending home sale. I had been trying to sell the house for 6 weeks. The buyer was waiting on disclosures. If Colleen got a lien filed, the disclosures would show an unresolved HOA dispute. The buyer would walk, and I would lose the contract. I asked Colleen if this was about the sale. She smiled and said she had no idea what I was talking about. I said, "You know the house is listed." She said that was public information, anyone could see it. I said, "You are trying to kill the sale." She said no, she was trying to enforce compliance, and if I had a problem with compliance, I could take it up with the board. I asked when the next board meeting was. She said 3 weeks. I said my buyer closes in 10 days. She said that was not her problem, and if I did not want a lien, I should pay the fine today. I told her I was not paying a fine based on a rule she could not show me. She said fine. Then she would initiate the lien process. I said, "Go ahead, I will file a dispute." She said disputes take months, and by then the lien would be recorded. I said that was retaliation. She said no, it was enforcement. I said I would call the management company. She said, "Go ahead and call whoever you want. I have a committee for that." That line stuck. She said it like she had people lined up to back her up no matter what I did. I realized this was not just about my house. Colleen had done this before. I went inside and called the management company. The receptionist transferred me to the property manager, a woman named Diane who sounded tired before I even said anything. I explained the situation. Diane sighed and said she would look into it. I asked if she could look into it today. She said she had back-to-back appointments and she would get to it when she could. I asked if Colleen had the authority to initiate liens without board approval. Diane paused and said technically no, but Colleen was the compliance officer, and she had discretion on enforcement actions. I said discretion does not mean she can invent rules. Diane said she understood my frustration, but she could not override the compliance officer without documentation. I said I have documentation. I am looking at the portal right now. There is no record of this fine. Diane said she would review it and get back to me. I asked when. She said by the end of the week. I said my closing is in 10 days. She said she would do her best. She hung up. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I pulled up the HOA portal and went through every board meeting minute from the last year. Nothing about sightline rules. Nothing about mail carrier complaints. Nothing about my address at all. I downloaded every PDF and saved them to a folder. Then I went back further. I found a meeting from 18 months ago where the board discussed hiring a compliance officer. The minutes said Colleen Collins was appointed as a volunteer position with authority to issue warnings, but not fines. I screenshot that. Then I found another meeting from a year ago where the board discussed updating the enforcement policy. The minutes said fines could only be issued after a warning and a 30-day cure period. I screenshot that too. Colleen had never issued me a warning. She went straight to a fine. I started thinking about the cold case. 6 months before I moved in, a neighbor named Rick had sold his townhouse in a hurry. I heard about it from another neighbor, a guy named Paul, who lived 2 doors down. Paul told me Rick had been hit with a $500 fine for a landscaping violation and a towing fee that made no sense. Rick disputed it, the HOA dragged it out, and Rick ended up selling just to get away from the fight. Paul said Rick never got his deposit back from the HOA for the landscaping bond. And when Rick asked for records, the management company said they could not locate the paperwork. Paul said he always thought it was shady, but he did not have proof. I asked Paul if he remembered who was compliance officer back then. Paul said it was Colleen. I texted Paul. I said I needed to talk about Rick. Paul called me 5 minutes later. He said what happened. I told him about the fine and the lien threat. Paul said that sounds exactly like what happened to Rick. I asked if Rick ever got documentation. Paul said no. Colleen kept telling him the board would review it, but the board never put it on the agenda. I asked if Rick had any records. Paul said Rick moved to Portland and he did not stay in touch, but Paul had a screenshot of a group chat where Rick posted about the missing deposit. Paul said he would send it. 2 minutes later, my phone buzzed. The screenshot showed Rick saying the HOA claimed he never paid a landscaping deposit, even though he had a canceled check. Rick said he tried to show the check to the board, and Colleen told him it was not valid because it was not processed through the current management company. Rick said that made no sense because the check was from 3 years ago when a different company managed the HOA. The thread ended with Rick saying he was done fighting and he was moving. I called Paul back. I asked if there were any other cases like this. Paul said there was one more he knew about. A woman named Sandra got fined for parking a trailer in her driveway. Sandra said she never had a trailer, and when she asked to see a photo, Colleen said the trailer was already removed, so no photo was needed. Sandra disputed it, and the board said they would investigate. but the fine stayed on her account and Sandra ended up paying it just to avoid a lien when she refinanced. I asked Paul if Sandra still lived here. Paul said no, she moved out last year. I asked if Paul could get in touch with her. Paul said he would try. Then Paul said something that made my skin crawl. He said, "You know Colleen has been doing this for years, right?" I said, "What do you mean?" Paul said Colleen has been compliance officer for almost 4 years, and there have been at least 5 or 6 cases where people got hit with fines that did not make sense, and every time the person either paid or moved. Paul said he always thought it was just Colleen being a stickler, but now he was wondering if it was something worse. I spent the rest of the afternoon pulling records. I requested every board meeting packet from the last 4 years through the public records request form on the portal. The system said my request was submitted and I would receive a response within 10 business days. I did not have 10 days. I needed answers now. I texted Paul and asked if he had access to any old meeting packets. Paul said he saved a few from when he was on the Architectural Review Committee 2 years ago. He said he would drop them off. Paul showed up at 6 with a file box. He said, "This is everything I kept." I opened the box. There were meeting packets, budget reports, vendor contracts, and a stack of compliance notices. I started with the compliance notices. Most were standard stuff: mailbox paint violations, lawn height, holiday lights left up too long. But 3 of them stood out. One was for Rick, dated 2 years ago, for unauthorized landscaping. One was for Sandra, dated 18 months ago, for trailer parking. One was for a guy named Tom, dated 3 years ago, for driveway resurfacing without approval. I asked Paul who Tom was. Paul said Tom moved out before I got here. But he remembered Tom got into a fight with Colleen over a driveway repair and ended up paying a fine even though Tom had receipts showing he got HOA approval before he started the work. I asked if Paul had any contact info for Tom. Paul said no, but he thought Tom moved to Eugene. I looked at the 3 notices. They were all signed by Colleen. They all cited operational guidelines instead of specific rule sections. They all demanded payment within 7 days. And they all had the same template: a header with the Enclave at Stonegate HOA logo, a paragraph explaining the violation, a paragraph citing authority, and a payment deadline. I opened my laptop and pulled up the notice Colleen gave me this morning. Same template. Same language. Same 7-day deadline. I laid them side by side. The similarity was not just visual. The wording was identical, except for the specific violation. It looked like Colleen had been using the same form letter for years, filling in the blanks, and no one had ever challenged the authority section. I pulled the authority section from my notice and compared it to the governing documents I downloaded from the portal. The authority section said the compliance officer has discretion to issue fines for violations of operational guidelines as established by the board. I searched the governing documents for operational guidelines. Nothing. I searched for compliance officer authority. The only mention was in the meeting minutes from 18 months ago where Colleen was appointed. The minutes said she could issue warnings, not fines. I went back to the budget reports in Paul's box. I found a line item for compliance enforcement revenue. Last year it was $8,000. 2 years ago it was $6,000. 3 years ago it was $4,000. The revenue was going up every year, and it was all coming from fines. I texted Paul. I said, "I think Colleen is running a scam." Paul called. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "She is issuing fines based on fake authority, people are paying to avoid liens, and the money is going into the HOA general fund." Paul said, "That is insane." I said, "Look at the numbers." Paul said, "Wait, if she is putting the money into the general fund, then the board would see it." I said, "Unless she is manipulating the reports." Paul said, "How?" I said I do not know yet, but I am going to find out. The next morning, I went to the management office. Diane was at the front desk with a forced smile that looked like it was held in place with duct tape. I said I needed to see the compliance enforcement ledger. Diane said that was not public information. I said it was HOA financial records, which are public under Oregon law. Diane said she would have to check with her supervisor. I said I will wait. Diane picked up the phone and had a whispered conversation. She hung up and said her supervisor was not available. I said I will come back this afternoon. Diane said the office closed at 4. I said I will be here at 3. Diane said she could not guarantee the supervisor would be available. I said then I will file a formal records request and copy the board. Diane sighed and said, "Give me a minute." She disappeared into the back. 5 minutes later, she came out with a printout. She said, "This is the summary. The detailed ledger requires a formal request." I took the printout. It was 1 page with 12 line items. Each line item had a date, a property address, a violation code, and a fine amount. My address was not on it. I said, "Where is my fine?" Diane said it had not been entered yet because I had not paid. I said, "So you are saying this fine does not exist in the system?" Diane said it existed, it just had not been processed. I said that is not how accounting works. Diane said she did not make the rules. I looked at the line items. 3 of them matched the names from Paul's box: Rick, Sandra, Tom. The violation codes were different, but the fine amounts were all in the $300 to $500 range. I asked Diane if I could get a copy of the detailed ledger. Diane said she would submit the request. I said I am submitting it now, verbally, and I want a response timeline. Diane said 10 business days. I said I have a closing in 9 days. Diane said she could not expedite without board approval. I said then put me on the next board agenda. Diane said the next meeting was in 3 weeks. I said I already know that, I want an emergency session. Diane said emergency sessions require a majority of the board to agree. I said then poll the board. Diane said she would pass along the request. I left the office and called my real estate agent. I told her what was happening. She said this was a nightmare and she would contact the buyer's agent to explain the delay. I said there was no delay yet, I just needed to kill the lien before it got filed. She said if the lien showed up on the title report, the buyer would walk. I said I knew. She said she would do what she could, but I needed to fix this fast. I hung up and checked my email. There was a message from the HOA portal system. My records request had been received and I would get a response within 10 business days. I replied and copied the entire board. I said I was requesting an emergency meeting to address a compliance enforcement issue that was threatening my home sale, and I needed a response within 48 hours. I attached the printout from Diane and the screenshots of the meeting minutes showing Colleen only had authority to issue warnings. 2 hours later, I got a reply from the board president, a guy named Dan. He said the board was reviewing my request and he would get back to me. I replied and said I needed a timeline. Dan said he would try to get an answer by tomorrow. I said tomorrow was not good enough. I had a closing in 9 days and Colleen was threatening a lien. Dan said he understood my urgency, but the board had to follow procedures. I said, "What procedures? There is no procedure for emergency meetings in the bylaws." Dan said he would check with the management company. I said I already talked to the management company. They said it required board approval. Dan said he would talk to the other board members. I replied and said I expected a response by end of business today. Dan did not reply. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the ending. At 4:30, I got an email from Colleen. The subject line was final notice. The email said my 7-day payment deadline was expiring tomorrow at 5, and if I did not pay the fine, the lien process would begin. She said the lien filing fee was $200 and it would be added to my balance. She said once the lien was filed, I would not be able to sell the property without paying the full amount plus interest and legal fees. She said she was giving me one last chance to resolve this amicably. The email ended with "I have all day, and so does my fine meter." I forwarded the email to Dan and copied the entire board. I said Colleen was threatening to file a lien based on a fine that did not exist in the HOA ledger and a rule that did not exist in the governing documents, and if the board did not intervene immediately, I would be forced to take legal action. I said I was also filing a complaint with the Oregon Department of Justice Consumer Protection Division for HOA fraud. I hit send. 10 minutes later, Dan called. He said we need to talk. I said I am listening. Dan said he talked to the other board members and they agreed to an emergency meeting tomorrow night. I said what time? Dan said 7. I said where? Dan said the clubhouse. I said I will be there. Dan said he wanted to resolve this, but I needed to understand Colleen was a volunteer and she was doing her best. I said Colleen was not doing her best, she was running a scam. Dan said that was a serious accusation. I said I had evidence. Dan said bring it to the meeting. I spent the evening building a presentation. I pulled every document I had. The meeting minutes showing Colleen only had authority to issue warnings. The compliance notices from Rick and Sandra and Tom. The budget reports showing increasing enforcement revenue. The ledger printout showing my address was not in the system. And Colleen's email threatening NG a lien. I put it all into a slide deck. Then I called Paul. I said I need you to come to the meeting tomorrow. Paul said I do not know if I should get involved. I said you are already involved, you gave me the documents. Paul said Colleen is going to be furious. I said let her be furious, she is the one breaking the rules. Paul said all right, I will be there. The next night I walked into the clubhouse at 6:45. The board was already seated at a folding table. Dan was in the middle. 2 other board members flanked him, a woman named Carol and a guy named Steve. Colleen sat in the front row with her plastic evidence sleeve on her lap and her tiny body camera recording. Paul sat in the back. I sat in the second row. Dan called the meeting to order and said we were here to discuss a compliance enforcement dispute. He said I had requested the meeting and I would have the floor first. I stood up and opened my laptop. I connected to the projector and pulled up the slide deck. Dan said we do not usually use presentations. I said this is not a usual situation. I started with the timeline. I said 18 months ago the board appointed Colleen as compliance officer with authority to issue warnings. I showed the meeting minutes. I said 1 year ago the board updated the enforcement policy to require a warning and a 30-day cure period before a fine. I showed those minutes. I said 6 days ago Colleen issued me a fine with no warning and no cure period. I showed her notice. I said I asked to see the rule I violated, and Colleen said it was an operational guideline. I said I searched the governing documents and there was no such thing as operational guidelines. I said I requested the compliance enforcement ledger, and my fine was not in it. I showed the printout from Diane. I said Colleen was threatening to file a lien based on a rule that did not exist, a fine that was not in the system, and authority she did not have. I said I believed Colleen had done this before. I showed the compliance notices from Rick and Sandra and Tom. I said all 3 of them had been hit with fines based on operational guidelines. All 3 had disputed it, and all 3 had either paid or moved. I said the HOA enforcement revenue had doubled in 3 years, and I believed Colleen was using fake fines to inflate the budget. Colleen stood up. She said that was a lie. Dan said, Colleen, sit down. Colleen said I was making accusations without evidence. I said I had evidence. Colleen said where was the proof that any of these fines were fake? I said the proof was in the ledger, or more accurately not in the ledger, because half the fines she issued never got recorded. Colleen said that was because people paid in cash. I said HOAs do not accept cash. Colleen said some people paid by check and the checks were deposited directly. I said that was not how HOA accounting worked. Every payment had to go through the management company. Colleen said I did not know what I was talking about. I said I had a degree in political science and I taught governance and public finance. Colleen said that did not make me an accountant. I said it made me qualified to read a budget, and the budget showed enforcement revenue going up every year with no corresponding increase in violations. Dan held up a hand. He said, let us focus on the immediate issue. He said I had a closing coming up, and Colleen was threatening a lien. He asked Colleen if she had documentation for the fine. Colleen held up the plastic evidence sleeve. Dan said, can I see it? Colleen handed it to him. Dan opened the sleeve and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He read it. He looked at Colleen. He said, this is a blank template. Colleen said it was the form I used to generate the notice. Dan said, where is the documentation of the violation? Colleen said the violation was observational. Dan said, who observed it? Colleen said she did. Dan said, do you have a photo? Colleen said no. Dan said, do you have a witness? Colleen said she did not need a witness. She was the compliance officer. Dan said that was not how it worked. He looked at Carol and Steve. He said, do either of you remember voting on a sightline rule? Carol said no. Steve said he did not even know what a sightline rule was. Dan looked at Colleen. He said, I do not think this fine is valid. Colleen said the fine was valid because she issued it. Dan said that was not how enforcement worked. Colleen said she had been doing enforcement for 4 years and no one had ever questioned her authority. Dan said maybe they should have. Colleen said if the board did not back her up, she would resign. Dan said that was her choice, but the board was not going to approve a lien based on a blank template. Colleen said fine, then she would file a complaint with the management company. Dan said the management company worked for the board, not for her. Colleen said she would file a lawsuit. Dan said, for what? Colleen did not answer. She grabbed the plastic sleeve from Dan and walked out. The door slammed. Dan looked at me. He said, I am sorry this happened. I said I appreciated that, but I needed confirmation the lien was not going to be filed. Dan said the board would send a letter to the management company rescinding any lien authorization. I said when? Dan said tomorrow. I said I needed it in writing tonight. Dan looked at Carol and Steve. Carol said I can draft it now. Steve said I will sign it. Dan said, all right, we will get it to you tonight. I said thank you. Dan said he wanted to look into the other cases I mentioned. I said I had copies of everything. I would email it to the board. Dan said he appreciated that. The meeting ended. I walked out to the parking lot. Paul caught up with me. He said that was intense. I said it was not over. Paul said, what do you mean? I said Colleen was not going to let this go. Paul said she resigned. I said she would resign, but she did not actually resign, and even if she did, she could still cause problems. Paul said, what kind of problems? I said I did not know yet, but I knew Colleen well enough to know she was planning something. 2 days later, I got a call from a towing company. The dispatcher said they had a contract with the Enclave at Stonegate HOA, and they were calling to confirm a tow request for my address. I said, what tow request? The dispatcher said the HOA reported my vehicle was parked illegally, and they were authorized to tow. I said my car was in my driveway. The dispatcher said the request said the vehicle was obstructing HOA common area access. I said that was not true. The dispatcher said she was just following the work order. I said, who placed the work order? The dispatcher said the compliance officer. I said the compliance officer did not have authority to order tows without board approval. The dispatcher said she did not know anything about that, she was just doing her job. I said if you tow my car, I will file a police report for theft. The dispatcher paused. She said, I am going to put you on hold. I waited. 3 minutes later, she came back. She said she spoke with her supervisor, and they were going to hold the tow pending confirmation from the HOA board. I said thank you. She hung up. I called Dan. I told him what happened. Dan said he would call the towing company and cancel the contract. I said Colleen was still calling tow drivers like she was speed dialing chaos. Dan said he would send an email to the management company and the towing company clarifying that all tow requests required board approval. I said I wanted a copy of that email. Dan said he would send it. I hung up and called Paul. I said Colleen just tried to have my car towed. Paul said, you are kidding. I said no. She called the towing company and lied about my car obstructing access. Paul said that is illegal. I said I knew, and I was going to use it. I spent the next 2 days gathering more evidence. I filed a public records request with the county for any liens filed by the enclave at Stonegate HOA in the last 4 years. The county clerk said it would take a week. I said I needed it sooner. The clerk said I could come in and search the records myself. I said I would be there tomorrow. The next morning I drove to the county building and spent 3 hours in the records office. I found 4 liens filed by the HOA in the last 4 years. 2 were for unpaid dues, which was legitimate. 2 were for compliance fines. 1 was for Rick, filed 2 years ago for $500. 1 was for Sandra, filed 18 months ago for $350. Both liens were released after the homeowners paid. I requested copies. The clerk said it would cost $20. I paid. She printed the documents and handed them to me. I looked at the signatures. Both were signed by Colleen Collins, compliance officer. I took photos of the signatures and left. I went home and pulled up the meeting minutes again. I searched for any mention of lien approval. Nothing. I searched for any mention of Rick or Sandra. Nothing. The board had never voted to approve those liens. Colleen had filed them on her own authority. I called Dan. I told him what I found. Dan said that was not possible. I said I had copies. Dan said send them to me. I emailed the documents. Dan called back 10 minutes later. He said this was serious. I said I knew. Dan said if Colleen filed liens without board approval, that was fraud. I said that was my point. Dan said he needed to talk to the board and the management company. I said I wanted a meeting with the regional supervisor. Dan said he would set it up. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday at the management office. I showed up at 10. Dan was there, along with Carol and Steve. Diane was there with a woman I did not recognize. The woman introduced herself as Monica, the regional supervisor for the management company. She said she had reviewed the documents I sent, and she had some concerns. I said concerns was an understatement. Monica said she agreed, but she needed to understand the full scope before taking action. I said I had evidence of at least 4 fraudulent fines and 2 fraudulent liens. Monica said she needed to see the evidence. I opened my laptop and showed her everything. The meeting minutes, the compliance notices, the budget reports, the ledger printout, the lien documents, the towing company call, and Colleen's emails. Monica took notes. When I finished, she said this was very troubling. Dan said, "What do we do?" Monica said she would conduct an audit. I said, "How long would that take?" Monica said 2 weeks. I said I did not have 2 weeks. I had a closing in 3 days. Monica said she understood, but she could not rush an audit. I said then issue a temporary suspension of enforcement actions until the audit was complete. Monica said she could do that. Dan said he would vote for it. Carol and Steve agreed. Monica said she would draft the suspension order and send it to the board by end of day. I left the meeting and went back to my house. I had 3 days to close, and I still had no confirmation the lien was permanently off the table. I checked my email. There was a message from my real estate agent. The buyer's agent was asking for an update on the HOA situation. I replied and said the board had suspended enforcement actions and an audit was underway. I said the lien was not going to be filed. I hit send and hoped I was right. That afternoon I got a text from Paul. He said, "You need to see this." He sent me a screenshot. It was from a private neighborhood Facebook group I was not part of. The post was from a neighbor named Lisa. Lisa said she had been at a coffee shop and overheard Colleen talking on the phone. Colleen was telling someone that the fine she issued me was legitimate, and the board was caving to pressure from a troublemaker who did not want to follow the rules. Colleen said she was going to file a formal complaint with the management company, and if the board did not reinstate her authority, she would make sure everyone knew the HOA was being run by people who did not care about property values. Lisa said she could not believe Colleen was still pushing this. Paul said Lisa asked if anyone else had been hit with bogus fines. 3 people replied yes. Paul said this was bigger than we thought. I called Dan. I said Colleen was still campaigning. Dan said he saw the Facebook post. I said we needed to shut this down. Dan said he could not control what Colleen said on social media. I said you can control what she says to the management company. Dan said Monica was already handling it. I said Monica was doing an audit. She was not stopping Colleen from filing complaints. Dan said he would talk to Monica. I said I wanted Colleen banned from the property. Dan said he could not do that without cause. I said she tried to have my car towed. That was cause. Dan said he would bring it up at the next board meeting. I said the next board meeting was 2 weeks away. I needed action now. Dan said he would see what he could do. The next day I got a call from a private investigator. She said her name was Karen, and she was calling on behalf of Colleen Collins. I said I was not interested. She said she just wanted to ask a few questions. I said no. She said Colleen had hired her to investigate allegations of harassment. I said allegations of harassment against who? She said against Colleen. I said that was ridiculous. She said she was just doing her job. I said I had nothing to say. She said she would be in touch. She hung up. I called Dan immediately. I said Colleen hired a private investigator. Dan said for what? I said she is claiming I harassed her. Dan said that was insane. I said I knew, but she was building a counter-narrative. Dan said, "What do you want me to do?" I said send a cease and desist. Dan said he would talk to the HOA attorney. I said do it today. I did not mention my evidence yet because I wanted her to repeat the story first. I had been holding on to something. A week before Colleen issued my fine, Paul had shown me a screenshot of a private group chat where Colleen was bragging about being able to make fines stick. She said she had a formula: issue the fine, threaten a lien, and most people would pay rather than fight. She said the board never checked her work because they trusted her. She said as long as she kept the fines under $500, no one would escalate to a lawyer. Paul had saved the screenshot. I had a copy on my phone. I had not shown it to Dan yet because I wanted to see if Colleen would dig herself deeper. She did. 2 days later, I was at the county recorder's office picking up another set of documents when I ran into a neighbor named Tracy. Tracy said she heard about my fight with Colleen. I said word travels fast. Tracy said she had her own Colleen story. 3 years ago, Tracy got a fine for a holiday decoration that was supposedly still up in February. Tracy said she took the decoration down in January, and she had photos proving it. Tracy showed the photos to Colleen. Colleen said the photos did not prove the date. Tracy said the photos had metadata. Colleen said metadata could be faked. Tracy paid the fine because she was refinancing and could not afford the delay. I asked Tracy if she ever got a receipt. Tracy said no. I said, did the fine show up on your HOA account? Tracy said she did not know. She never checked. I said, you should check. Tracy said, why? I said, because I do not think Colleen ever recorded it. That night I called Tracy and asked her to pull her HOA account history. Tracy logged into the portal and looked. She said there was no record of the fine or the payment. I said, did you pay by check? Tracy said yes. I said, do you have a copy of the canceled check? Tracy said she would look. 10 minutes later, Tracy sent me a photo of the check. It was made out to the Enclave at Stonegate HOA for $275. The memo line said holiday decoration fine. The check was dated 3 years ago. The endorsement stamp on the back said it was deposited into an account at a local credit union. I asked Tracy if the HOA used that credit union. Tracy said she did not think so. The HOA used a big national bank. I said I needed to see that account. Tracy said how? I said I would figure it out. I called Monica the next morning. I said I had new evidence. Monica said she was still working on the audit. I said this could not wait. I told her about Tracy's check. Monica said she would look into it. I said I needed access to the HOA bank records. Monica said that required board approval. I said then get board approval. Monica said she would talk to Dan. I said I wanted an answer today. Monica said she would try. At 3 that afternoon, Monica called. She said the board approved access to the bank records. I said, when can I see them? Monica said she would pull them tomorrow. I said I would be there at 9. Monica said she needed time to review them first. I said I was part of the records request. I had a right to see them. Monica sighed and said, fine, 9:30. I said I would be there. The next morning, I walked into the management office with Paul. Monica was waiting with a thick binder. She said this was 5 years of bank statements. I said I only needed the last 4. Monica opened the binder and pulled out a stack of statements. She said, here. I sat down and started going through them. Paul sat next to me. We looked at every deposit. Most were dues payments, which matched the ledger. But there were about a dozen deposits that did not match. They were all in the $200 to $500 range. They were all labeled missed payment or compliance payment. None of them had corresponding entries in the enforcement ledger. I took photos of every one. Then I noticed something. The deposits were all made by mobile check deposit. The deposit slips did not show an account number, but they showed a timestamp and a device ID. I asked Monica if she could trace the device ID. Monica said she would have to contact the bank. I said do it. Monica said she would submit a request. I left the office and called Dan. I said I had proof. Dan said proof of what? I said proof that Colleen was pocketing fines. Dan said that was a serious accusation. I said I had a dozen deposits that were not in the ledger, and they were all made by mobile deposit. Dan said that did not prove Colleen did it. I said it proved someone did it, and Colleen was the only person with access to the fines. Dan said he would talk to Monica. I said I wanted a showdown. Dan said, what do you mean? I said I wanted Colleen in a room with the board and the evidence. Dan said he did not think that was a good idea. I said I did not care. I wanted answers. Dan said he would see what he could do. 2 days later, I got a call from Monica. She said the bank confirmed the device ID belonged to a phone registered to Colleen Collins. I said, send me the report. Monica said she would email it. I said I wanted the board to see it. Monica said she already sent it to Dan. I said, what is the next step? Monica said the board was meeting tomorrow to discuss it. I said I wanted to be there. Monica said it was a closed session. I said I was the one who uncovered the fraud. I had a right to be there. Monica said she would ask Dan. 10 minutes later, Dan called. He said I could attend, but I could not speak unless asked. I said fine. The meeting was at the management office. Dan, Carol, and Steve were there. Monica was there with a man I did not recognize. The man introduced himself as Craig, the management company's legal counsel. Craig said he had reviewed the evidence, and it appeared Colleen had been diverting HOA funds for at least 3 years. He said the total amount was estimated at over $12,000. Dan said, what do we do? Craig said the board had 3 options: file a police report, demand restitution, or both. Dan said, what do you recommend? Craig said both. Carol said, what if Colleen refused to pay? Craig said then the HOA could file a civil lawsuit. Steve said, how long would that take? Craig said months. Dan said, we do not have months. Craig said, then file the police report and let the system work. Dan looked at me. He said, what do you think? I said, file the report. Dan said, all right. He looked at Monica. He said, draft a termination letter for Colleen and a police report. Monica said she would have them ready by end of day. Dan said, send them to me for signature. Monica nodded. Craig said there was one more issue. He said the HOA insurance policy had a clause that excluded coverage for intentional acts by officers or agents. If Colleen's actions were deemed intentional, the HOA would not be covered for any legal fees or damages. Dan said, what does that mean? Craig said it meant if any of the homeowners Colleen defrauded decided to sue, the HOA would be on the hook. Dan said, how much are we talking? Craig said potentially tens of thousands. Dan put his head in his hands. He said this was a disaster. I said it was a disaster Colleen created. Dan said I knew. I said then fix it. Dan said we are trying. The next day I got an email from Dan. Colleen had been terminated as compliance officer and a police report had been filed. The email said the board was offering restitution to any homeowner who had been improperly fined. The email included a link to a claims form. I forwarded it to Tracy and to Paul. Paul forwarded it to the neighborhood group. Within 2 hours, 6 people had filed claims. Within a day, it was 12. A week later, I got a call from a detective with the Bend Police Department. He said he was investigating the HOA fraud case and he wanted to ask me some questions. I said I would be happy to help. He said he had reviewed the documents I provided and he had some follow-up. I met him at a coffee shop. He asked me to walk him through the timeline. I did. He took notes. He asked if I had any direct communication with Colleen about the fines. I said I had emails. He said send them to me. I said I would. He asked if I knew of any other victims. I said I had a list. He said send that too. I said I would. He thanked me and left. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the management company. The letter said the audit was complete. The audit found that Colleen had issued 42 fines over 4 years. Of those, 18 were never recorded in the HOA ledger. The total amount diverted was $14,300. The letter said the HOA was refunding all improperly issued fines and pursuing criminal charges. The letter said my closing had been cleared, and there were no liens or encumbrances on my property. I called my real estate agent. I said we are good to close. She said finally. I said, you have no idea. The closing happened on schedule. I signed the papers. shook hands with the buyer, and walked out with a check. I called Paul. I said, "It is over." Paul said, "Congratulations." I said, "Thank you for your help." Paul said, "Any time." I said, "What happened to Colleen?" Paul said, "She was arrested last week." I said, "For what?" Paul said, "Fraud and theft." I said, "Good." Paul said the HOA is also suing her for restitution. I said, "I hope they got every penny." A month later, I got a call from Monica. She said the regional supervisor wanted to meet with me. I said, "Why?" Monica said she could not say over the phone. I said, "All right. When?" Monica said tomorrow at 2. I said I would be there. The next day, I drove to the management office. Monica was there with a man in a suit. The man introduced himself as Greg, the regional director. He said he wanted to thank me personally for uncovering the fraud. I said I was just protecting myself. Greg said I did more than that. I exposed a systemic problem. He said the management company was implementing new controls to prevent this from happening again. He said every compliance officer would now be required to submit monthly reports that were reviewed by the board and the management company. He said all fines would be entered into the system within 48 hours, and any discrepancies would trigger an automatic audit. He said the company was also requiring all enforcement actions to be approved by the board before any lien or tow was initiated. I said that sounded like a good start. Greg said it was because of people like me. I said I appreciated that, but I just wanted to sell my house. Greg laughed. He said he understood. I heard later that Colleen was convicted of fraud and ordered to pay full restitution. She also had to write a formal retraction letter to every homeowner she had fined, admitting the fines were improper. The HOA refunded the fines and fees tied to the scheme. Colleen's favorite fee got proven imaginary in the ledger when the audit showed there was no line item for sightline violations and no board vote authorizing them. A regional supervisor intervention that strips Karen's informal authority became company-wide policy. Compliance officers could issue warnings, but only the board could authorize fines or liens. I moved out of state and never looked back. I appreciate you hanging in there.